What's up, everyone? This is the Nuts and Bolts Podcast, and I'm your host, the one James, here with your lovely co-host, Airball,
Hello, everyone.
and Michael Kritz, but he'll be out today. And we're here to give you the nuts and bolts of the Standard and Pioneer formats each and every week for your listening pleasure. Maybe you'll learn a thing or two. Today's going to be more based on Standard, as there was a few Standard tournaments that happened, and we're going to look at what's working and what isn't. But first up, let's go to the upkeep. We're going to talk about some jargon. We're going to talk about what a 2-for-1 is and a 1-for-2. You hear this all the time with different cards in Standard, and I'll explain to you what that is right now. It's shorthand for whether or not a play provides net card advantage, or in the case of a 1-for-2, card disadvantage. A 2-for-1 occurs when a player uses one card and the opponent uses or loses two cards. Removing a Graveyard Trespasser, for example, in Standard and Pioneer, forces a 2-for-1 situation, since the opponent must discard an additional card to cast the removal spell that targets it, or else it will get exiled. Magic is usually a game of resource management, and usually the player with more cards than your opponent will win. There's a little bit of other circumstances where that's not the case, but usually the person with the most cards in general will win the game. One of the decks that relies on card advantage in the form of killing your opponent while they have cards in hand is a deck like Mono Red, which, is still kind of card advantage, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a relationship between cards and tempo and a bunch of other resources, but yeah, I think you've done a good job explaining it.
Yeah, so that's your jargon for today, but we're going to move on to our draw step, because that's what happens after the upkeep. And that's where we're going to go into a brief overview on what's working and what isn't from the new Dominaria United Standard format. I'm going to go over a few cards/decks, and we're going to kind of go back and forth on some things. And then we're going to go to the main phase, which we're actually going to talk about 3 different tournaments that happened over the weekend and some of the ins and outs and decisions and decks that go along with it. But first up, we're going to talk about what's working. And I don't know if it's obvious or not, but maybe you've played Arena, maybe you haven't, but it's all the black-red X decks. And you put black-red in the deck, and you put whatever other color you want with it, and it's probably going to work. What do you think?
Yeah, it's kind of similar to the last Standard, where blue-red X dominated because Expressive Iteration was just so good. Now, black-red is where all the value's at. Fable of the Mirror Breaker, just too good not to play. And we got a bunch of really good recursive value black cards that are seeing a ton of play in these tournament lists.
Yeah, we're going to go over that in just a bit, but if you're playing black-red in your deck, you have a good shot at doing well. Next, we're going to talk about, or overview, Esper Midrange. There was a few Esper Midrange that made top cuts in various tournaments, and we're going to go over what those are, but, it's the same Wedding Announcement, Wandering Emperor, Rafine decks that you've seen from last Standard. The very card advantage based, everything's a 2-for-1, as we talked about before, in Wedding Announcement, maybe some Graveyard Trespassers, things like that. What do you think about Esper Midrange?
Yeah, I think Esper midrange is in a pretty good spot. Again, the more things change, the more they stayed the same. Esper was great in the last Standard too. It did lose, stellar cards like Vanishing Verse, but a lot of the big threats that Esper wanted to play were hit by Vanishing Verse anyway. So now you can play your 4 copies of AO the Dawn Sky, like the winning list from the MTGO challenge this week, and not feel too bad about it.
Yeah, that's something that kind of goes under the radar, is now all of these Junji, the Midnight Sky, and different things like that are being played now. And you're not very afraid of your Tenacious Underdog getting exiled with just a 4-of removal spell that deck's playing, right? So, Vanishing Verse not being in the format definitely affects it, and in a way makes just these decks even better, weirdly enough.
Yeah.
Let's go to let's name 4 different cards that also is what's working. Number 1, I want to mention Squee Dubious Monarch. This is a card that is in the Jund midrange decks, in some black-red midrange decks, some black-red aggro lists, maybe some mono-red here and there, but it is in a good amount of the top-cut Standard decks in the sideboard, if not one of main deck. I really like Squee because how well it plays into Liliana of the Veil, and we'll touch on Liliana a little bit later in the podcast, and also how well it plays into Invoke Despair. What do you think about Squee?
Yeah, I'm gonna toot my own horn a little bit and say that I nailed this on the last podcast episode. Squeeze great. It's Den of the Bugbear after Den of the Bugbear has rotated, but also it comes back from the graveyard, so it synergizes well with all the discard in the format. Fable the Mirror Breaker, Liliana. I love this card.
I was playing Judd midrange on stream, and I kept losing to Invoke Despair and Liliana, sacrificing my good threats. And I was like, wait a second, I could just play Squee and none of that matters. My opponent resolved 4 copies of Invoke Despair in a single game, and I won the game because I had Squee and no other reason. It was crazy.
Yeah, it's just an incredibly solid card.
Next card that works is the Cruelty of Gix. This is a card I don't think any of us were talking about last week on the podcast in our top 5 cards. But when you want to hit all of your land drops, right? Because when you go Cruelty of Gix, you can just search another Cruelty of Gix and then play it and then bring a Titan of Industry back or whatever else you're bringing back. There was a couple Reanimator decks that had Cruelty of Gix in it, but it's also just an extremely valuable card in a way that it's almost like a 3-for-1. It kind of reminds me of what is that old saga that was played like 4 years ago or something like that? What was that called again?
You're talking about the Eldest Reborn.
The Eldest Reborn. So it's kind of like the power crept Eldest Reborn of this format, and allowing you to search for any card in your library that's always Meathook Massacre, cough cough, but it's just really, really good.
Yeah, and the read ahead on the card is something you can't ignore either. Like the first chapter, duressing your opponent effectively is something that's not very great in the late game. But if you can just skip that chapter, then all of a sudden you know the next play you're going to make is going to be incredibly powerful and affect the board. And then you've got something coming back from the graveyard after that.
One thing I've done with 10 mana with Cruelty of Gix is Cruelty of Gix, go ahead and read ahead for the second chapter, search another Cruelty of Gix, like I mentioned before. I'm going to expand on that a little bit. Play the second Cruelty of Gix, but look at their hand this time and discard something. And then the next turn, your other Cruelty of Gix that just was on two counters is now on 3, and you get to reanimate whatever you just discarded from their hand.
Yeah.
And then you get to search, and then the other one triggers, and you get to search another card. So it's like, it's just like an endless spiral of card advantage that your opponent probably can't come back from.
Yeah, it does kind of rely on you or your opponent having relevant creatures in the bin. If you're up against control, the Eldest Reborn could bring back Planeswalkers, so it was basically always guaranteed to have something. This actually does require a little more work and is a little more situational, but when it works, oh my god, is it great.
Well, yeah, you're playing Fable the Mirrorbreaker, discarding Titan of Industries anyway, right? You're bound to have one in the graveyard, or maybe your opponent's, maybe it's a mirror match because Jund is everywhere and you're bringing back their Titan of Industry. It's just crazy. Moving on because I don't want to spend too much time on Cruelty of Gix. It's a very powerful card. We're going to move on to Soul of Windgrace. This is in every single Jund list as well. I've seen anywhere between 1 and 3 copies. I don't think I've seen one with 4 copies of it since it is legendary, but Soul of Windgrace is basically, I didn't catch this last week on the podcast, but I heard someone say it. I think it was like Chris Patello that was saying it on stream, but he said it was Renin 6 at home, and I kind of have to agree with him.
Yeah, Soul of Windgrace is one that sort of slipped under my radar a little bit. It seemed like a weird commandery Muldrotha card, and I didn't really give it the time of day. And I figured that it was just too much work to get these different modes to work. But if you have like a land in the bin when this comes into play, it already just ramps you into your turn 6 plays, which are pretty powerful in the standard or making 2/3 drops at a time. And with Fable of the Mirrorbreaker in every single red deck, it's not that hard to get the land in the bin. So you get your value right away, and then it's a must-remove threat later.
Not only that, there's 2 other things. Number 1, you play 4 of the Riveteer land that sacrifices itself to get a black, red, or green mana source anyway, and you play 4 of that. So it's kind of likely you have that. And if you don't have that, maybe you're discarding a land off Fable of the Mirrorbreaker, like you said, but it can also get your opponent's lands too. So if they discard a land, or they mill one, or they have a fetch land, you also get theirs. So it's really weird in the mirror match with you having to like exile your own lands from the graveyard to play around their Soul of Windgrace. So it gets kind of out of hand. Not to mention, we didn't even mention it's a 4-mana 5/4. So
that's not bad.
It works on Enter the Battlefield and attacking. So you just keep hitting your land drop every single turn. It makes it to the point where if you don't remove Soul of Windgrace, you're going to lose the game. And that's going to lead us into our next card, which we kind of disagree with. Sheoldred the Apocalypse. This card is in almost every single one of the top Red Black X lists that we're going to go over in a few minutes. And it's at 2 copies in almost all of them, if not 1 copy. There's a few of them that don't play this card, but it's in most of the top 8 decks that we're going to go over. And much like Soul of Windgrace, this card is either you remove it or you lose. An argument against Shieldred, I'm going to let Airvault talk about, and then I will give my reaction. So, what do you think of Shieldred the Apocalypse?
Yeah, I think the main reason we disagree about this card is that you're looking at what was good this last week, and I'm looking ahead to what will be good in the coming week. And I think that Shieldred was good this past week and is in a lot of these decks because it dodged a lot of the removal that people brought. So people brought Cut Down doesn't hit it. People brought red-based removal, it's a 5 toughness creature. Red-based removal is not great against it. So these decks just couldn't deal with it. And Vanishing Verse has gone from the format, of course, so it looks a lot better. But then
I'm gonna
going
cut you
forward,
off and say you're proving my point. All right, go ahead.
yeah, so it was good, but I don't think it will be going forward because mid range is dominating the format, and in mid range mirrors or in mid range metas, people bring blue, and this card does not play nice against counter spells. It doesn't like being countered at all. And people are going because it's black and because black has had so much success. The more general purpose, cheap black based removal, I think, will start to show up in the format in a way that will make Shieldred look pretty bad.
I do want to say that about Shieldred and the removal that you're talking about that will hit Shieldred. There's not a lot because Vanishing Verse rotated. You can't even play the other one that doesn't kill angels or dragons or demons anymore. Power Word Kill. So what are you gonna play? Infernal Grasp. You have to Infernal Grasp during your own upkeep to not take 4 life from killing this card. Because you have to take the 2 off Infernal Grasp and then the 2 off drawing a card for turn from Shieldred, or just hold it up on your end step for when they cast this. And how many Infernal Grasp do you have to play in your deck to consistently kill Shieldred if people are playing 2 copies or 3 copies of this in their deck? It also Omega stabilizes you against mono red, Ghoul, different decks like that, and we're going to go over why those decks aren't as good as we thought they were. And it might, for some reason, be because of Shieldred, the Apocalypse in these mid-range decks. It's a brick wall against anything that's trying to kill the deck. And when you think about the decks that are trying to be more aggressive than this mid-range deck, say Gruul aggro or mono green or maybe even like a red-white aggro deck that we've seen in the past standard, the red-white aggro deck has a lot of the same cards. We still have the 4 mana 3/3 haste that puts counters on things. We still have Brutal Cathar. We still have Hopeful Initiate. We lose Luminarch Aspirant, but there's still Thalia. There's still a lot of these cards that are still very powerful in that deck. And if you don't have Brutal Cathar, I mean, Shieldred just stabilizes you 100%, especially if you start drawing extra cards off of Fabled Mirror Breaker with Shieldred out to gain 6 life in the turn that you do that. There's just a lot of life gain to stabilize you. So, I mean, what do you think about the anti-aggro aspect of this card? Because the decks that are aggro are playing like 4 damage based removal, or maybe even like a little bit of exile removal. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Shieldred is a good card against aggro. There's no doubt about it. But I also think that mid range is dominating the meta right now. And in like the traditional rock paper scissors game of aggro mid range control, mid range is usually what beats aggro anyway. So like, yes, you can have Shieldred and utterly stomp aggro, but I think you can also just not have it and do just fine against aggro and improve your matchup against control.
Yeah, I was playing Control today, and I countered a number of Shieldreds, and it does feel good to counter Shieldred. But that might be the most efficient way to deal with it, is to just counter it. Removing it, you might have to take 2 life to remove this card, which isn't that big of a deal when you think about it. But when your opponent's already the aggressor, taking 2 damage to remove Shieldred like isn't as much of an option anymore, and it gets like really annoying really fast. But anyways, there is that card that kind of ends with the what's working, and that's a card that is probably going to be in the what's not working if we do it maybe next week. But we're doing it this week, and that's what worked over the weekend. So we're going to talk about Shieldred working. Anyways, moving on to what isn't working. Quirion Beastcaller is a card that I really thought would be a staple. It would put mono green back on the map. It would make Gruul aggro really good again. And honestly, looking at the deck lists that topped and even did well in the tournament, I think the best version of Aquarion Beastcaller aggro deck was like 3-3. Like none of them top 8, if not like one of them maybe top 8 at like a 5-1 or something. But Aquarion Beastcaller is a card I thought would be really good, but it hasn't seemed to be good enough right now.
Yeah, I think that Quirion Beastcaller, like we talked about in the last podcast episode, is really good against spot removal and really bad against board wipes. And mid-range decks, at least the ones that I saw over the weekend, were mostly running board wipes instead of targeted removal. The Meathook Massacre immediately comes to mind. So if you can Meathook Massacre the board such that the counters it puts on other creatures don't matter or don't have targets, then all of a sudden this card doesn't look so great.
One of the things about Quirion Beastcaller that I thought would be really good is that it dodges Meathook Massacre by, um, you know, throwing itself when you cast other creatures. But I honestly think the sheer presence of cut down makes Quirion Beastcaller just like you can't play it on turn 2. If you play it on turn 2, it's getting cut down like almost every time. All the black decks are playing at least 3 copies of cut down. There's a lot of voltage surge going on. If you don't have a 1-drop into the 2/2, if you don't have a really good start, I think cut down is just too good against Quirion Beastcaller. Unless you can cast it on a turn that the opponent is tapped out, and then also cast another creature in the same turn. That's kind of a lot to ask for.
It is a lot to ask for. The only other place where a card like Quirion Beastcaller might be good is if it opens the door for your bigger threats to get through that removal. So if the opponent has to cast their cut down on Quirion Beastcaller, that's one less cut down they have for a future threat. The problem is that cut down already wants to be cast on your 1 or 2 drop and was never going to kill your 3 or 4 drops anyway. So Beastcaller doesn't open the door in that way against the dominant removal in the format.
Yeah, I agree. Next thing we're going to go over is the Izzet / blue-white tempo decks. Talking about the last podcast, I really thought that going over the new Dominaria cards, that blue-white tempo, mono-blue tempo would really be back on the map with the tools that it got in the format. But it did really bad over the weekend. There was no Izzet decks and no blue-white tempo decks / mono-blue tempo decks that did good at all. I think there was maybe one blue X, maybe it was like a blue-red Delver deck that did okay, but for the most part, it was either 3-3 or losing records all weekend.
Yeah, so these are the kinds of decks that have like the aggro versus mid-range problem that we were talking about earlier, but it's got it extra bad because it relies on a tempo element that these mid-range decks, at least the ones in the format right now, are already really good at dealing with. So like instead of playing really good efficient threats that are normally good against control, it plays really bad threats that are good because they're backed up with cheap counter magic that pay it off. That's not great against mid-range decks that run super efficient removal like Fatal Push or Cut Down. So traditionally, Mono Blue Spirits doesn't have a great matchup right against Rakdos and Pioneer. I think the same is holding true in Standard right now.
I think the more efficient your threats and counter spells and protection spells are, the better it becomes against Rakdos, and you can see that in the Rakdos midrange against Mono Blue Spirits and Pioneer matchup. You can see that in Rakdos sometimes has an overwhelming amount of two mana removal in the form of Stomp with Bonecrusher Giant, Abrade, different things like that. Then maybe there's 3 mana removal like a Mulligan's Command and things like that are just too much mana of removal. So if you can get that 1 mana creature down and then play a land and hold up like a 1 mana counterspell / protection spell, you can out-tempo the Rakdos deck. But I think it's a little bit more 50-50 than you're making it, like Rakdos against blue-white spirits, but I think Rakdos might have like a 55% edge.
Yeah.
I think it's like a
and
little
if you're
bit favored,
45,
but you can definitely win with mono blue.
Yeah, but if you're 45% against the deck that's dominating the format right now, then that's not a great place to be in a tournament.
Oh, right. You're just hoping to dodge that deck as much as you can and beat all the mono green in Pioneer.
Yeah, and that's probably what they were trying to do in these standard tournaments, and it just did not work out.
Oh, no, it didn't work. If the entire format was just mono black control, then mono blue spirits, or not even just spirits, mono blue / blue white tempo / is it Delver tempo, I think would be really strong.
Sure.
But there's not enough
Yeah.
mono black. I mean, we're gonna go into mono black. Mono black did, whereas I was a little bit more impressed with mono black in these tournaments than I originally thought, and maybe that's what the blue white tempo deck was trying to go after. With maybe mono black has to tap out for Invoke Despair, and you can just counter that and get in. But maybe they just didn't get the right matchups. But it's really hard to play a blue white / is it tempo deck with a black X mid range. Every deck is black red X mid range. There's Grixis all over the place, Jund all over the place, Rakdos all over the place. And if every deck is black red X, you're gonna have a hard time with blue white tempo.
Yeah, 100% agree.
All right, the next card that I think was broken, and it is nowhere to be found. I have not found a single deck with this card in it, I don't think. If you can look really deep into the decks that went 1 and 3 or 1 and 4 and dropped, maybe they have this card in it, and it's your favorite card. If you listen to the last podcast, you will know how high Airball is on temporary lockdown. So I'm gonna let him talk about it for a second.
Yeah, I do want to point out that the third place deck list in the Crookies tournament was running 3 copies of the card. But, at the beginning of a new format, control is usually disadvantaged because people are trying new stuff. There's a big variety of threats in the format. And when there's a variety of threats, there's a saying in Magic that there's no such thing as a bad threat, but there are bad answers. And in the early days of a format, it's very hard to line up your control deck's answers with the variety of threats that you expect to see in a tournament. So it doesn't surprise me that control decks did not do well in the first couple of tournaments. I haven't given up on this card yet. I think that control, once the meta settles, control will do better, and then I think temporary lockdown will do a little better than it did.
I think there's just so many incredibly efficient 3-mana cards in standard that I don't know if this card ever makes a main board. Like in the future, was this card a main deck 3 of?
This was a main deck 3 of and another in the board.
Wow. I mean that might be a reason why the Rakdos Anvil decks didn't do as well. Maybe temporary lockdown got the good matchup, but a lot of the 2-mana threats, at least most of them, that are in the black red X decks, and usually these decks are pretty greedy with the Cruelty of Gix, Soul of Windgrace, Shieldred, like we already talked about, Invoke Despair all over the place. There's not many 2 drops to go around, right? I mean, it takes the Fable token and the treasure tokens and the blood tokens and the Blood Tithe Harvester and the Tenacious Underdog, right?
Yeah.
But I think a problem I have with temporary lockdown right now is that there is an abundance of Invoke Despair. So if you don't have multiple enchantments on the board, Invoke Despair is definitely getting rid of temporary lockdown. And if it didn't exile a bunch of tokens, they're going to get their cards back.
Yeah, no, I think temporary lockdown is a card that's going to go in and out, sideboard, main board, sideboard, main board, because I think that control is going to come back with a vengeance. It's going to eat these mid-range decks alive in the next few weeks, and then people will switch to aggro, and then temporary lockdown will be really good against aggro. So people will switch back to mid-range to prey on the aggro decks, and we'll board out the temporary lockdowns again. But it's a very valuable tool for the control decks to have, and we haven't had access to something like this before. And something that completely shuts down the Rakdos artifact deck makes me very happy.
Oh, it makes me happy too. I think it'll be a lot better in Pioneer than it will be in Standard. In Pioneer, I think there's just too many good 3 and 4 drops that so many decks play that I don't know if it at the end of the day sees a bunch of play, but in Pioneer I think it's absolutely amazing and an effect we haven't had in a long time, if not.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Let's go ahead and I touched on this already, but the Rakdos Anvil deck, I've seen a Rakdos Anvil deck with like 4 copies of Braids in it, and I was kind of low on Braids in the last podcast if you heard about it, but Braids is really good in maybe this one deck, Rakdos Anvil Sacrifice, but it did not do well at all. There was probably 1 or 2 that did kind of well, but I don't know if any of them top 8'd. Maybe one of them did, but I would expect that this deck would be very good coming out of it being really good last Standard, and it just didn't do as well over the weekend.
Yeah, Rakdos deck with 4 copies of Braids did make the top 8 in the Crokey's tournament. So all hope is not lost for this card. But it just doesn't really seem to do enough. I think standard is at a even post rotation standard is at a point where we want our cards to do a little bit more than Braids does.
Yeah, and not Braids specifically. I don't think I'm picking on Braids when I talk about this Rakdos Anvil. Braids doesn't get killed by cut down, which is important. But the Rakdos Anvil deck is worse with how many decks are playing Meathook Massacre. And if you have a Black-Red X mid-range deck, they're all playing Meathook Massacre, at least 3 copies in the main deck of literally every deck. And it's searchable with Cruelty of Gix. So you have to figure out a way to kill the mid-range decks super quick, or else you're going to get buried by all the card advantage that the Black-Red decks have.
Yeah, it's kind of got the Liliana syndrome too, where it's the victim of its own success. If a lot of people are playing this card, if a lot of people are playing crap to the board that they don't mind sacrificing, then all of a sudden Braids is not super compelling. And I think that the core of the artifact deck is not nearly as strong in a standard that doesn't have a whole lot of um, control versus one that has a ton of mid range with an actual proactive game plan that can just kill you.
I also think we haven't mentioned this yet, but Rakdos Anvil lost the best card in the deck. Not Anvil, but it lost Deadly Dispute. And that is a major, major blow. And that's probably one of the other reasons why I didn't do it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right.
Moving on to the last one from the draw step here in what isn't working is Mono Red and Boros Aggro. We talked about this already a little bit, so let's touch on it a little bit more. Mono Red, I think, is in a place where it could be good when the control decks figure out how to beat the mid-range. When the control decks figure out that they need to counterspell Shieldred and counterspell Windgrace and counterspell Invoke Despair, and have have interaction that deals very well with the threats that they're playing. Maybe some graveyard exile as well, because graveyard exile is very important against Tenacious Underdog. So there's a lot of things that can go into control decks coming back against those mid-range decks in the future. And I'm interested to see what happens this week. But when those decks end up beating the mid-range decks are going to have to evolve into something else. But that opens the door for Mono Red and Boros Aggro to beat the control decks. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. We talked a lot already about the rock paper scissors game that is standard right now. I think Mono Red and Boros are also just a little bit underpowered right now compared to what the rest of the meta is doing. Most of the good Mono Red tools right now are high up the mana curve, which kind of incentivizes you to like play the more mid-rangey kind of strategies that are not great against control anyway. So I'm not sure that Mono Red finds a home, a good place in the meta, even if control starts to take over. I think Mono White might be better, but yeah, I could see Mono Red doing something. It's just not what I expect to happen.
Yeah, we have really good tools. We have Play with Fire and Lightning Strike now, so I could see it, but I'm not convinced. That's the reason, and it also just I'm convinced now, especially because I know that it didn't work over the weekend. Mono Red and Boros Aggro did very, very bad over the weekend in all 3 tournaments.
Yeah.
Moving on to our main phase, we are going to talk about these 3 tournaments in a little bit more detail on exactly which decks made the top 8 of them. I do want to mention a little bit of a thing that I learned, is that I thought Liliana of the Veil would be a little bit more prevalent, but even in almost every one of these decks playing black mana, it's only played in about 50% of the black decks, and there are almost never 4 copies of them. There's 4 copies in a few different mono black lists, but mono black is almost the only thing playing 4 copies of Liliana. I've seen 2 Lilies, I've seen 3. What do you think about, did the meta adapt to Liliana already, or are people trying out different numbers of Liliana in their decks? What do you think?
Trying to come up with a way to say it that doesn't sound dirty, but like Liliana's not great at playing with herself.
No, it doesn't sound dirty at all. I don't know why anyone would
yeah,
think that.
you know,
No, yeah.
If you know what I mean, right?
No, I don't know what you mean. Explain.
Well, I'm glad you asked. So Liliana wants to play like a low resource game, right? Liliana wants to put a bunch of stuff in the graveyard, wants to get both players hellbent, get into a top deck war with like incidental value from the graveyard. So you want your deck to be full of good top decks. And Liliana is not really a great top deck, particularly if you already have one in play. You don't really want to be drawing copies 3 and 4. And like you said earlier in the podcast, there are a lot of good 3-drops in the red and black colors. You don't need to play 4 copies of Liliana because you could be playing any other 3-drop. I think two or 3 is probably the right number. There was an article written by Reed Duke actually recently on Channel Fireball Pro, where the Reed Duke has cast a lot of Lilianas of the Veil.
That's true.
Knows the card better than most people, and even he says that usually you don't want to play 4 copies in any one deck.
Yeah, I was experimenting with 4 copies of Liliana. Yeah, you never want to draw 2. Sometimes your opponent has a useless creature on board, and the one you actually want to get rid of, you can't sacrifice because they have a 1/1 off of Wedding Announcement, or maybe it's a 2/2 off of Fable the Mirror Breaker, and then there's a Graveyard Trespasser right next to it, but you know you can't kill it. So you minus Liliana just to, I guess, kill the 2/2, and then Liliana dies to Graveyard Trespass. Or your opponent has a Tenacious Underdog on the board, and they're just going to cast it back and kill it after you minus on it anyway. So there's a lot of just incidental creatures, and people know already that Liliana's in the format, and Mono Black will play it, and there's going to be some number of it in Red Black X decks. So they're going to be playing cards like Squee that we mentioned already that kind of dodges the Liliana minus ability, and also people want to not sacrifice their best creature from Invoke Despair, and Invoke Despair is pretty much everywhere in the format also. So they're going to want to diversify their creatures into a little bit go wide, even though going wide is a little bit worse against Meathook Massacre. So you want creatures that have a little bit higher toughness, but you want that like 1 or 2 creature on the side that you can just sacrifice to Liliana at whatever time or Invoke Despair. So I think that's what's like kind of pushing Liliana away from being in most decks, and it's about in 50%.
Yeah, the other thing is that Liliana doesn't do great. It's weird. Liliana doesn't do very well in formats where Liliana's doing well. If that makes sense. Because, yeah, I might not have explained that super well. But if you expect to be playing against a lot of other decks that are playing Liliana, then your Lilianas get a little bit worse because everyone else is building their strategy around her as well. They have stuff that they actively want to discard. So they're already perfectly comfortable playing Hellbent, discarding stuff to their graveyard, getting value from their graveyard. Compelling them to discard and forcing yourself to discard at the same time is card advantage neutral and helps their game plan as much as it helps yours. She's not great if she's widely played.
Yeah, I've definitely discarded my Tenacious Underdog, and my opponent discarded an Infernal Grasp, and I was like, we are winning this.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, after we talked about Liliana, let's go ahead and get into it. This is what we're here for, the actual tournament data. Now, switching over to the new page here, if you're watching this on YouTube, we also have a YouTube channel if you're listening to this a podcast. And by the way, if you're listening to this on YouTube, we also have a podcast channel. Anyways, now that I have that out of the way, let's go ahead and look at the first tournament here, which is the Crokies tournament. And there is a deck that we haven't talked about yet that I do want to talk about. Elliot Dragon makes the most perfect decks ever conceived. I think I just want to farm every deck that he's ever made and just play them. He has one of the third, fourth decks. Let's talk about the first and second deck, and they're pretty much the same deck. First place is Rikimaru Boys that played Jund. Now, the 19 creatures that it plays is, of course, Bloodtithe Harvester, Graveyard Trespasser, Soul of Windgrace, Squee, Tenacious Underdog, Titan of Industry. But there's a couple cards I want to point out here, for those of you listening that aren't watching this, is Florian Voldarian Scion was a one-of creature, which I do like a lot. This is more of an aggressively slanted build that I've seen of Jund. It's pretty much just like Rakdos aggro, splash some really good green cards, right?
Yeah, what are the green cards? What do we have 3 copies of Titan of Industry, we have 1 copy of Soul, one random copy of Outland Liberator, Primeval Warden. Yeah, this is like a weird deck that has a ton of one-ofs in it. I guess if you're doing the reanimation thing, then it benefits you to have a good variety of targets in your graveyard, so you can pull back the one that is perfect for the situation.
Yeah, I do think that that's the reason why there's one-ofs here. There's 3 copies of Cruelty of Gix, and I wanted to mention this card in the what's working section because this card can go search for, if you need to get rid of a Fable of the Mirror Breaker or maybe a Reckon or Bankbuster from your opponent, you just go search Outland Liberator with it, play it, sacrifice it, good to go. If you need a way to counteract Liliana or Invoke Despair, go get your Squee. You want a way to, your opponent's not going to be able to deal with a Junji Midnight Sky, go ahead and search out that one, play it. It's a 5/5 Flying Menace. There's different like silver bullets that you can get off of Cruelty of Gix. That is not maybe the Meat Hook Massacre or March of Wretched Sorrow. There's 3 copies of Cut Down, 2 copies of Terra Sunder, which is slowly becoming one of my favorite cards in the format. It's a instant speed binding the old gods, basically. Exile target non-land permanent by paying 4 mana, black, green, and 2. And it's a really, really strong effect, especially since Exile is really good in this format. A lot of times people want to play their Titan of Industry, it dies, they reanimate it from Cruelty of Gix. But if you can exile the Titan of Industry or exile the Squee, exile the Tenacious Underdog, it's very, very strong. And then there's another silver bullet here as well that we didn't mention yet, the Elder Dragon War, which is the 4 mana 4/4 Read Ahead Saga that deals 2 damage to all creatures, and then it can discard any number of cards in your hand and then draw that many cards, and then it also makes a 4/4 dragon. So this is a interesting list. One card we also didn't talk about is Namada Primeval Warden. This is one of the 1/ofs that it plays. It's 2 black, green, 3/4 legendary Treefolk with reach. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. When you do, create a 1/1 green Saproling creature token. You can pay a green and sacrifice a Saproling. Namada Primeval Warden gets +2/+2 till end of turn. And you can pay 1 and a black and sacrifice 2 Saprolings to draw a card. So it has a really nice what is that card in Rakdos Midrange and Pioneer that's really good. It's like
I was going to call this Kalidas at Home.
Yeah, it's a Kalidas at Home, and you can go ahead if your opponent is playing the Rakdos Anvil deck, or your opponent has maybe a Tenacious Underdog in play, you can just search for Namada Primeval Warden, play it, kill your opponent's Tenacious Underdog, and then you get a 1/1 Saproling and it exiles the Underdog. So overall, this is a type of deck that you would expect to win the tournament as of right now, since Black Red X is so good. But I mean, what do you feel about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're learning from looking at these decks and the discussions that we've been having, it's that exile-based removal is at a premium, and without Vanishing Verse, the exile-based removal is also not super great. There's a Soul Transfer in black is probably like the best one that I've had success with playing this past week. But like this card fits super well, and I like the Swiss Army knife toolbox approach that the Cruelty of Gix plus the Reanimator strategy from Junji enables.
Yeah, I do like that as well. I like this build. Let's check out the next Jun list that actually got second place. This is not as low to the ground, but it also has a little bit of a Graveyard synergy. It's playing way less copies of Graveyard Trespasser. I think the first place list played 4. This one only plays 1. The differences in this deck is it plays 2 Old Rutstein, which is a 3 mana 1/4 legendary creature, and at the beginning of when it enters the battlefield at the beginning of your upkeep, you mill a card, and then it does things based on if a land was milled, if a creature was milled, and if a non-creature non-land card is milled. It makes blood tokens, treasures, and 1/1s. And this is just a beefy 1/4, I guess. It hasn't been very popular in Standard over the past few months, even before rotation, but we knew that after rotation, certain cards that were not as good when Expressive Iteration and Goldspin Dragon were everywhere were going to become better. And Old Rutstein makes second place in this tournament, so there's at least something to say about that. It does mill your cards for Soul of Windgrace, and this deck is playing 3 copies of Soul of Windgrace instead of 1 for the other list. And I mean, I gotta tell you, Soul of Windgrace majorly impressed me. I've already talked about it. Not much else to say about it, but it just impresses me. 3 copies in the second place list. 2 Titan of Industries and 2 Workshop Warchief. This is a card that I've really liked. It's the 5 mana 5/3 Blitz Rhino with Trample. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. When it dies, it makes a 4/4 green Rhino, and the Blitz is for 6 mana. So it's a I don't know. What is this Thragtusk at Home that we were talking about a while ago that this card is? And it just has a bunch of other removal spells. And actually, This has a couple cards in it that we haven't mentioned yet. One of my cards from the last podcast, Jaya Fiery Negotiator, is played at 2 copies in this deck. The 4-mana red Planeswalker with 4 loyalty that makes a 1/1 Prowess Monk. It can exile cards off the top of the library to cast them. You can kill your opponent's creatures by attacking with your own creatures, and then you get a win emblem that wins the game by copying your spells. Whether that was played to make a bunch of 1/1s and go wide because they were expecting people to play Liliana of the Veil and Invoke Despair, maybe that was a nod to that, or maybe it did more for this deck. I don't know because I didn't watch the games being played. There's also Teachings of the Kirin, is a 2-mana enchantment saga that mills 3 cards, make a 1/1 spirit token, put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control, and then it exiles to return as a 1/1 that you can exile creatures from grave and make 1/1s and put counters on your things. Maybe that's a nod to Invoke Despair also, because it's an enchantment that you can just sacrifice to that. I don't know for sure, but this is more toolboxy as well, and this is also playing Cruelty of Gix. What do you think about this list that compares to the first place? It's a little bit different.
It is a little bit different. It's different in ways that I think I mostly like. I think the inclusion of Workshop War Chief is great. I think that's the mid-rangey card that every deck wants in this kind of meta. I think I love it. And not a bad reanimation target either. Blitz is great as a way to beat down any control decks that you run into. I think that's a great inclusion that was missing in the last one. I also love Jaya. I think that there's when you have these board stall situations or you have these low resource games that are pretty common given the cards that people are playing. Top decking a Planeswalker, particularly one of the better red Planeswalkers that we've seen in Standard in the last probably 5 or 6 years, is great. What I don't like about this list, I think it's a little rough around the edges. The 2 copies of Old Rutstein seem very weak to me. That card has never once impressed me. I think we could probably be doing better there. Not being able to control what you get off of it is pretty painful. It's not really a super relevant body, and it's not something that compels the opponent to answer it. And I think that's we're in a heavy hitting slugfest of a meta. I don't think this card does enough. And Teaching of the Kirin falls to the same bin for me. I know it enables milling, but Fable of the Mirror Breaker does that. Bloodtithe Harvester makes that. How much self mill do you really need to pay off your Soul of Windgrace?
I mean, this was 1 match away from winning the entire tournament. I do have to mention that Old Rutstein does die to Cut Down, which is another reason why it's not as good. All of a sudden, cards that die to Cut Down are become way less valuable, even if they're 3-drops. Like Brutal Cathar, I think just instant speed gets killed by a 1-mana spell now, which is probably another reason why we haven't seen red-white aggro do very well. There's this Old Rutstein card that dies to it. There's Rafine dies to it now, so we've seen a little bit less of that. Alana and Elena dies to Cut Down, so maybe that's the reason why Gruul hasn't been as good. Also, Reckless Stormseeker dies to Cut Down, so that's probably another reason why Gruul or Mono Red isn't as good. So Cut Down is definitely one of those cards that if a good threat of yours dies to it, it's probably just not a good threat anymore.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want to line up well against the good removal in the format, but also, like, you want to play threats that compel your opponent to spend their premium removal. And if I was playing against Old Rutstein, I don't know that I would particularly care. I feel like it's one of the lowest impact things that someone could possibly do to me.
It's incremental value, though, Airball. Think of the value.
It's the most incremental value possible. It's like the Xenos paradox of value. You're getting a little bit closer to mattering every single time, but you never quite get there.
But then 3 turns later, after you didn't deal with it because you think it doesn't matter, it starts mattering. You get 3 1/1s. You get like 2 1/1s and a treasure token. That can come up. It can matter.
Sure, yeah. If we go 4 turns without me being able to answer a threat, honestly, if any 3-drop that I leave on the board for that amount of time should probably kill me.
All right, so you're saying that it is a good threat.
I'm saying that if you're playing against Sparky, it will probably get the job done. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Just for the record, it's a good threat. If it has on the board for 4 turns, let's just keep it at that.
Sure.
This deck is also just playing 1 Cut Down. It just doesn't care about other aggro decks. I guess maybe just Old Rutstein just too big of a body. I'm gonna get off the old Rutstein train. One Infernal Grasp, one Soul Transfer. We heard you talk about. It chose to play Voltage Surge over Cutdown. And by the way, old Rutstein makes artifacts, but okay. I said I was going to stop with old Rutstein, but I'm just not going to stop anymore. Voltage Surge,
I
Exile.
think you just like saying. I think you just like saying
I
Rutstein.
do. It's fun to say. Voltage Surge sacrifices the artifacts that old Rutstein makes, and also artifacts that Fable the Mirrorbreaker makes. But so I guess that's why they chose to play Voltage Surge over Cutdown. I'm not sure which one's better. I could probably go back and forth on which one it is, but I know Voltage Surge might be better if you can utilize it.
Yeah, I mean, Cutdown will kill a creature that has 5 total power or toughness, right? Or
Yes.
less. Voltage Surge will kill anything with 4 toughness or less, pretty much all the time in a deck like this. Um, that just seems like it hits more stuff to me than Cutdown does. I think if you have the artifact support, Voltage Surge is probably pretty good.
Right. All right. Well, that is that Jun list. So let us know in the comments if you which Jun variant you like. The earlier one that we talked about ended up beating this one in the finals. We have Jeskai Control as the 3rd/4th place with Elliot Dragon playing it. This is more up your alley, Airball, and this has a little bit of like a pseudo combo in there. It's not a combo kill per se. I guess it could technically be, but we have Teferi who slows the sunset that untaps your artifacts and lands and creatures. And then we also have 2 copies of Timeless Lotus. They go together as you play, Teferi on turn 4, you play Timeless Lotus on turn 5, and then it comes into play tapped, and it can tap for all colors of mana, but you untap the Timeless Lotus and a land, so you get 6 extra mana after you play the Timeless Lotus on the turn that you play the Timeless Lotus.
Yeah. When I saw this card spoiled, I immediately thought of Teferi. And it's not really surprising because that's exactly what happened when Key to the Archive was printed into Alchemy.
Yep.
This Teferi Key to the Archive combo dominated Alchemy for a long time until there was rebalances happening, and I thought that was just because of the insane mana advantage it provides. So I thought, surely, if we put Teferi and Timeless Lotus into the same deck in Standard, we're going to be well on our way. And what I found when I was doing this was that there just wasn't a whole lot of high-end payoff for having a ton of extra mana at sorcery speed on your turn. And I think probably the best use for the mana in this deck is the Silver Scrutiny, 3 copies in the Instants and Sorceries section there, which is the card draw spell, the X card draw spell that has flash if X is 3 or less, draw X cards. So you can create a bunch of mana on your turn, pump a bunch of mana into Silver Scrutiny, leave up your counter magic for your opponent's turn, and draw a ton of cards. So that's, I think, where most of the value is in the format for the Teferi Timeless Lotus combo right now. And to me, that's just not worth it. Like, let's just play more copies of Memory Deluge. I don't think the Teferi Timeless Lotus combo is there yet, but check back in a future standard where we have something bigger to do with our big mana.
This is the only deck that top 8 at a tournament playing Temporary Lockdown. This is a Jeskai control deck. It's playing 2 copies of Farewell, which is also something that you can use the 6 mana with. Your opponent has a huge board. They didn't kill the Teferi. I guess they probably should kill Teferi, but maybe you untap the land and cast a March of Otherworldly Light on their creature to stop Teferi from dying. Next turn, play Timeless Lotus, untap, and then you play Farewell in the same turn, which you can do because that's 6 mana, right? Which is pretty important.
Yeah.
And then you can also like Witness the Future and then into a counter magic, or Witness the Future into something else you want to play, whether that's Urtai's Scorn, which is the counterspell that he's one of the counterspells he's choosing to play. There's a Negate, Temporal Firestorm that you can also cast. But Witness the Future has actually impressed me. I played this card recently in a Dimir control deck, and not only can you recycle your own stuff, but you can return all of their graveyard, all of their graveyard tenacious underdogs back into their deck. It's super strong. So there's definitely a use for Witness the Future in this format that wasn't their last format.
Yeah, I think that's true. returning to the discussion about Farewell, I think Farewell is pretty well positioned in the meta right now. Not like super well positioned, but any board wipe that like lets you deal with both aggression and the graveyard is pretty nice. I will say that Farewell and Timeless Lotus don't play super well together because a lot of the time you're casting Farewell against a deck with a bunch of artifacts. They're like maybe vehicles or the Rakdos artifact builds. Having to exile your own Timeless Lotus to Farewell, not really super appealing, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do, I guess.
A lot of the times that I've seen on streams and things is that Farewell was just the win con button when your opponent plays a bunch of Cruelty of Gix, a bunch of new sagas that have come out. They have underdogs on the board and in the graveyard. They have they're getting a huge board. Maybe they just cast Titan of Industry or revived it off of Cruelty of Gix. Maybe they have usually it's like an enchantment and creature in graveyard card in standard right now, I think. The only artifact you really care about in a control deck like this is maybe a unlicensed hearse. It's like the only thing I can think of I think in order to keep the Timeless Lotus around, you're okay with letting them keep some blood tokens, I think.
Yeah, that's probably true. It is interesting to me that there's 4 copies of Bankbuster on the board and none in the main. I saw a bunch of decks with Bankbuster in the main having success. So it's interesting to see that there's 4 copies on the board. There's also a ton of like one-ofs in this deck, even more than I'm used to seeing in a control deck. Normally, decks that have a lot of card draw and card selection, you get away with having one drop or one-ofs in your deck because you just find the silver bullet that you need. There's a lot here, like one random negate, one random Urtai Scorn, one random March of Otherworldly Light. It's definitely an interesting deck building decision. I'm not sure what you think about that.
It's also a light up the night.
Yeah.
And Light of the Night is really good against, like, with Timeless Lotus. Like, this deck utilizes the kicker very well in kicking Temporal Firestorm. You know, you would think that 9 mana is a lot to kick Temporal Firestorm twice, or maybe 7's a lot to kick it once, but with Timeless Lotus, you can just do anything you want. And that's a good use of the mana. To answer your question about the one-ofs, I just think that's definitely just how Elliot Dragon builds decks. Like, I know him personally, and he just does this with, like, every deck that he makes. And if you see his sideboard, he'll probably have the same thing in his sideboard. The only thing he has more than 1 copy of is Hullbreaker Horror at 2 copies, Negate at 3 copies, and Record of Bankbuster at 4 copies. Everything else is a one-of. One of Anointed Peacekeeper. I mean, it's a 3/3 Vigilance, I guess. One of Disdainful Stroke, one of Farewell, one of Fateful Absence, one of Temporary Lockdown, and one of Unlicensed Hearse. And I think that's just a more of a testament of like how he builds decks than actually like an anomaly.
Sure. It is the control player in me is interested that we have 4 copies of Negate in the 75 and 1 copy of Disdainful Stroke. Because it feels to me like Disdainful Stroke ought to be a lot better. But maybe Negate is just a nod to how important cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker are to be able to counter.
Oh, definitely. Disdainful Stroke, the only thing that Disdainful Stroke stops that Negate doesn't stop is the big AO, the Dawn Sky, Junji, the Midnight Sky, or I think that's the name of it. I think that might, and like a hard cast Titan of Industry.
Or Shieldred, or Workshop War Chief, or...
Well, if you're playing this deck, you don't really care about Shield, right? Like you don't really care. There's a lot of removal
Sure.
for that, right?
Well,
I guess
really.
not too much, right? There's what, Temporal Firestorm deals 5 damage to the creature, which is important. There is Urtai Scorn that can counter it. There is Farewell that can exile it. There is March of Otherworldly Light that can exile it. And that might be it. Oh, Wandering Emperor exiles it. There's 4 copies of it.
Yeah, I mean, if your opponent's ever going to attack into Wandering Emperor mana.
Well, they definitely will, because they have to kill you at some point, right? If you have a Timeless Lotus and a Teferi Sons of Sunset, you're going to die very fast.
That's probably true.
I think this deck is really interesting. I'd be interested to see how good this deck will be when people know about it, or are maybe gunning for it, and this maybe becomes more popular since the top 8 of this tournament. I've seen different streamers playing this deck already, including I think Ali Eldrazi actually played this deck either today or yesterday, right after he found out that Elliot Dragon played it. So if this gets more popular, then then you might see, this is one of those decks, right, that you say, oh, maybe mono red or maybe Boros aggro can be good if a deck like this is beating the red black X mid range decks, and this could be it.
Yeah.
Moving on to what came in third or fourth place, and this kind of counteracts everything that we just said about the format right now, but this is, I think, more of the exception than the rule. White Weenie got fourth place in the Croquis tournament, playing, cards that you already know about, right? If you're listening to this and you've been following Standard for a while, Adeline, Hopeful Initiate, Intrepid Adversary, Lunarch Veteran, and Spirit Companion are played in this deck. But there's some new cards in here as well. There's 2 Anointed Peacekeeper, which is the 3-mana 3/3 Vigilance that looks at their hand and chooses a card, and it costs 2 more to cast, and also activated abilities with sources of that cost 2 more as well.
Paulo at home.
Paolo, Vitor, Domidarosa at home, yes. We have 4 Guardian of New Benalia, the 2-mana 2/2 enlist creature. Whenever an enlisted creature, you scry 2, which is probably the only playable enlist creature in Constructed. And it also has the discard a card. Guardian of New Benalia gains indestructible to end of turn and tap it. So this has the ability to block and attack through things very well. Dodges removal. Doesn't dodge Meathook Massacre or Blood Tithe Harvester, which I don't think makes this deck very good. But maybe this dodges the black-red X decks in the tournament. In having a lot of ways to answer this, but another just really good 2-mana creature to play. And then also plays Resolute Reinforcements. It is the Raise the Alarm of the formats. 2-mana 1/1 human soldier with flash, and then it makes a 1/1 when it enters the battlefield. So just another way to go really wide. And then 2 copies of one of my favorite cards, Sarah Paragon. This card made enough top 8s that I did not put it in our what isn't working category, but it's a little bit less played in top 8s than I originally thought it would be. But this card just lets you reuse almost every single card in this deck. If not literally every card in this deck is a permanent. So yes, it can get literally every card back in this deck. The 4-mana 3/4 flyer, and then you can play lands or cast permanents of mana value 3 or less from your graveyard. And then when they die, they get exiled and you gain 2 life. So it's just another way of, I guess it's just like the Legion Angel of this deck. If you're used to playing mono white from a past format, it is just a top end card that gains you a lot of value if it goes unanswered. It can kill your opponent. And then we have 8 more other cards that aren't necessarily creatures. 2 Restoration of Iganjos, and I think that's why they're playing 4 Spirited Companions as well to bring that back. 2 Wandering Emperors and 4 Wedding Announcements. So, looking at this mono white Weenies deck, how do you think this made the top 8 in this tournament? It's the only mono white deck that topped, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. This deck made some weird deck building choices. Now, I'm not an aggro player, so I can't speak with any authority here, but it is weird to me that in post-rotation Standard, there's a mono-white deck that is playing only 2 copies of Wandering Emperor. To me, that seems strange. It's playing Restoration of Aganjo, which I think is pretty bad from a tempo point of view. It's fetching a land for you that is not going to really cast anything that has CMC greater than 4 anyway. So I don't really like buying the land from the deck. Putting a Spirited Companion into play off the second chapter, all right, that's kind of cute. But this deck wants to get the opponent dead, and Restoration of Aganjo doesn't really seem to do that. 4 copies of Wedding Announcement, yeah, good card, I can see that. But yeah, it's weird to me that in a post-rotation Standard where everything got much weaker, you trim on what is pretty obviously the best white card in the format.
Yeah, but you also probably gain another best white card in the format, Sarah Paragon. I don't think mono white Weenies was ever playing 4 copies of Wandering Emperor, or maybe even like 3 at the most. Restoration of Aganjo is definitely an interesting pick, but maybe it is a nod to them playing Spirited Companion and they want to bring it back out of the graveyard, because Restoration of Aganjo has the same text as Fable of the Mirrorbreaker, where you can just keep looping it back every single turn, and if it dies, you can just bring it back and it loses the exile clause with Sarah Paragon. That's probably why they're playing it, in the synergy with that card. It's great synergy. And also, in a couple turns when the Restoration of Aganjo gets you the 3/4, it makes your deck a little bit better against Meathook Massacre. A little bit hard to cast Meathook Massacre for 4 when they're going to die. So, in one way, it makes sense. In another way, it doesn't. But maybe, I mean, we see here it made the top 8, so it worked at least for this tournament.
Yeah, this is almost like mono white mid range in a way. Now that you're talking about it, instead of mono white aggro, you've got the Lunarch veterans that come back from the bin. You've got the Restoration of Vaganja. You've got the Sarah Paragons, wedding announcements. Yeah, this isn't as aggressive as a deck as I thought it was going to be at first glance.
It does have aggression that is really annoying, though. Like, Adeline kills your opponent within like 3 turns if it goes unanswered by itself. You don't need
Yeah.
anything else. So this is probably the most value-filled white deck that I've seen. And maybe it had to go the value way to beat the red-black X decks. And maybe they played this deck and they were like, I'm losing too much to Meathook Massacre. I need to be better against that and better against the threats in Rakdos. And maybe this deck just ate up Rakdos with the amount of wedding announcements that were played. And when you play 2 different wedding announcements back to back against Rakdos, Rakdos kind of loses.
Yeah, this is a cool one. It still strikes me as underpowered compared to what the rest of the format is doing, but I can see how it made a top 8 with a skilled pilot.
Yeah, same here. Let's see. We have this Esper deck that made the top 8 here that we touched on earlier, so we're not going to go too much into detail with this. The Painlands help this deck a lot with casting Rafine and everything on curve. This is more of a flash deck, though. This build has Fairy Vandal, the 2-mana 1/2 flash flyer. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Fairy Vandal. Plays that, and played Obscura Interceptor that has the Connive ability, which also triggers a Fairy Vandal. It has Rafine that also triggers a Fairy Vandal to draw additional cards in a turn. It has 4 Resolute Reinforcements. So this is definitely an Esper flash deck that has some elements of Sorcerer Speed things like Wedding Announcement, Rafine, and Kaido, but everything else is flash. We have Wandering Emperor in here as well, and then everything else, like I said before, has flash. We have 2 Meathook Massacres in here to be better against. It's just a really good card. I don't even have to explain, Meathook Massacre. But what do you think about this Esper build?
It's really cool. I think this speaks to the power of the Painlands. Obviously, this is an aggressive deck. This is one that's trying to get you dead early, get on the board, and then lock you out of ever playing a relevant spell until they kill you. But they do need to kill you. And in the past, decks like this have really struggled just deploying their threats to the board because casting, Kaito and the Wandering Emperor in the same deck, Obscura Interceptor is a tough one to cast. Rafine is a very hard card to cast. The mana bases just didn't support it. But you can see in this mana base, you have 3 copies of a Dark Hour Waste, you have 3 copies of Caves of Koilos. Those are dual lands that always come in untapped, no matter where they fit on your curve. That enables these kinds of strategies to work. I think this is pretty cool. I might play this myself.
I mentioned that. I mean, this is as close to a tempo deck that can win as you can possibly think. This is, remember earlier on in the episode where I was saying that blue-white / red-blue tempo was very bad. This was the only one that kind of resembles what that could make. Maybe that, but it's like taking a step up. It's not the general tempo list that you would think of. Play a 1-drop, play a protection spell, counter your opponent's spell with a Spell Pierce. This is more doing like 3 and 4 mana things, and some things are at sorcery.
I'm looking at the sideboard, and there are 3 copies of Depopulate though. So this is like a tempo deck that can just pivot into like Esper midrange. You can just cut the Fairy Vandals, and all of a sudden, and the Resolute Reinforcements, bring in the Depopulates and the Shieldrids, and all of a sudden you've got the makings of like a very decent Esper midrange to control-y build.
Yeah, I think this did the old switcheroo post board. Looking at that, and Knockout Blow is a card that is rarely played, but it is really, really good against red creatures. And guess what's a lot of the format? Red creatures. The 3-mana instant, it costs 2 less to cast if it targets a red creature, and it deals 4 damage to it if it's attacking or blocking, and you gain 2 life. So, I think this goes into major control stabilize mode.
Yeah, 3 copies of this in the sideboard is a lot of respect for red, and it looks like it paid off.
You know what also it kills, right? Lord of Windgrace.
That's true too. Yeah.
Yeah, Lord of Wingus is red and it has 4 toughness. So, yeah, if you like tempo decks and you're listening to this, definitely try out this deck. You see it on the screen right now from Lil Pumpkin that played this Esper Rufine Flash deck. All right, moving on to a Grixis deck, which is, you guessed it, red-black X deck. It is playing a lot of the cards that you've seen before: Blood Tithe Harvester, Tenacious Underdog, Cut Down, Infernal Grasp, Voltage Surge, Fable the Mirror Breaker, Liliana of the Veil. This one is probably the only non-mono black deck that played 4 copies of Liliana of the Veil in these tournaments, and 2 Meatuk Massacres, but we have some blue cards here to mix it up as well. We have 4 Corpse Appraisers, which is very, very good with Fable the Mirror Breaker. We have 2 Evelyn the Covetous, which is the 5 mana 2/5 flash threat that exiles cards off the top. We have 2 Make Disappears, which I think is a little bit low, but maybe just 2 Make Disappear is what you need. 2, and then the last blue spell is 2 Kaidos. So this is as close to just generic Grixis mid-range as you can get. It's labeled Grixis aggro. It can kill your opponent pretty quick with the Blood Tithe Harvester on turn 2 or Tenacious Underdog into Corpse Appraiser on turn 3 to really get your opponent dead pretty quickly. This is kind of one of the mid-range decks that maybe I would play. It just looks like it has a lot of card advantage, a lot of things to do. What do you think about this deck?
Yeah, this Grixis is the deck that I had the most success with playing in Standard the last few weeks. I think I went 5-0 with a Grixis list, not this one. My list wasn't playing Evelyn. It was playing Urtais in the main instead. But what impressed me a lot was the Corpse Appraiser playing against. It's just such an awesome mid-range card. It's just a good at-rate creature that produces card advantage if there's a creature in the graveyard, which there always is. It's graveyard hate in a format where that is really starting to matter. Kaito is really, really, really good in mid-range mirrors.
Oh, that got 3 realies.
Yeah, no, Kaito impressed me an awful lot. It's hard to remove a planeswalker right now. Like, just straight up remove one without a creature. Kaito phases out, which protects him on the turn he comes into play. And you have a bunch of little crappy creatures that can come down and protect him later and attack to turn on his draw spell ability. 4 copies of Liliana, quibble with that. I think 4 is too many. 2 or 3 is probably right. But overall, I think this deck is the way to go. Particularly because when you have mid-range mirrors, having access to blue is just so good. And you can see this deck is only running 1 copy of Negate in the sideboard. I think if you just add a few copies of Disdainful Stroke, you're going to be in great shape against the other mid-range decks in the meta.
Yeah, this deck will feast on mono black, will feast on big control decks, the bigger mid-range decks, because the Make Disappear, Negate, the counter spells that blue provides you, the card advantage that blue provides you, is gonna make you it's gonna get you into positions where you're in a mid-range mirror, but you're countering their spells and your spells are resolving. So that's a really good spot to be in as the Grixis player. Also, Corpse Appraiser, the Graveyard Exile that you mentioned, exiles Tenacious Underdog, exiles Squee from the graveyard. It's not just, exile a creature. It's like a really relevant ability. And it also gets you a card and mills the rest of the cards so that you can also utilize them out of your own graveyard as well. Like, there's 4 Tenacious Underdogs in this deck, and that has to be a nod to Corpse Appraiser, because you can just... It's so good to exile your opponent's thing. You get a 3/3. You get a card off Corpse Appraiser, and you mill an Underdog. It's almost a 4-for-1, right?
I lost track. That's how good it is.
Yeah. Anyways, I think I lost track too. But anyways, this does have Urtai Resurrected in the sideboard. So it does board that in. It is the Dimir 4-mana flash card that can either kill a thing and your opponent draws a card, or stop it can either counter a spell and your opponent draws a card, or you can counter your own triggers and spells and creatures to draw a card yourself. Very, very good flash card. But I do like this Grixis deck a lot. Now, we have 2 other Rakdos decks listed as Rakdos Aggro, but I believe they are more mid-range decks. There's a bunch of Graveyard Trespassers, Sheoldreds, 4 Lilianas in this deck as well, 4 Fable the Mirror Breakers. One of them has Evolved Sleeper, and then one of them has Braids, Fellstinger, and Balduvian Atrocity. This is more of a sacrificey deck as well. This one has 4 Voldaren Epicures, and it really wants to utilize Braids Arisen Nightmare. And this is the only Rakdos Anvil deck that made a top 8, which is one of the reasons why I thought this was on the downswing and what's not working. But this specific build, maybe you might choose to go to if you want to play Rakdos Sacrifice. This one, Balduvian Atrocity, is a 3 mana 2/3 menace creature with kicker for 1 red. That it says when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return a creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So you can bring your Bloodtide Harvester back. It gets haste, and then you can sacrifice Bloodtide Harvester to kill something. Really strong. You can bring your Braids back with Balduvian Atrocity, and and Braids will come into play, attack or not attack, and then at the end step trigger its ability, even though it's going to die. And then this doesn't say another creature you control, so you can Balduvian Atrocity back Braids, and then sacrifice the Braids, even though it's going to die anyway, and get that trigger. Fellstinger, which I guess is this deck's version of Deadly Dispute now. Sacrifice a creature, then you draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, and you're going to be sacrificing Voldaren Epicure and Virus Beetle, and killing your opponent with Oni Colt's Anvil, burn damage, a bunch of 1/1s, a bunch of cards that are kind of hard to deal with, and 2 copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse. What do you think about this version of Rakdos Sacrifice?
Yeah, losing Deadly Dispute hurt. There's really no way around that. Looking at this deck, the lack of card advantage really does stand out. Relying on Fellstinger.
Yeah.
Relying on Fellstinger to draw you cards is not really where you want to be. And I look at these Oni Cult Anvils, and I'm thinking, I don't know that these are ever going to produce a ton of value. You're making some blood off the Bloodtithe Harvester, yes. You're making, like, the Virus Beetle is itself an artifact, so there's that. But other than that, there's not really a whole lot of artifact generation going on, and there's no loop, importantly. There's no, like, great cat oven kind of effect here that I'm excited to play.
I think it's a little bit sneaky, the amount of artifacts this has. There's Oni Cult Anvil, of course, itself is an artifact. Fable the Mirror Breaker makes treasure tokens. Bloodtithe Harvester makes blood tokens, and also Voldaren Epicure makes blood tokens, and Virus Beetle is an artifact itself. So there's quite a bit of artifacts, but just not. It doesn't have the experimental synthesizer in here that you're used to seeing, right?
Yeah,
in here, which is a little bit of card advantage. So it's kind of trading the synthesizers with, like, Braids and Fellstinger. I would say I'm not sure if it's good enough, but it did top 8 this tournament. It does have just really, in general, really good cards in it, like Bloodtithe Harvester and Fable the Mirror Breaker, and maybe it just burned their opponents out with Shieldred and a bunch of the other ways that they can burn their opponent. It also does a good job at playing against Liliana of the Veil and Meathook Massacre, not Meathook Massacre, Liliana of the Veil and Invoke Despair, because Invoke Despair can't make your opponent sacrifice artifacts specifically. So it might have had a lot of wins just by burning your opponent out, and I can see this deck winning that way. This deck burns a lot. It Braids deals 2 damage every turn if you can't sacrifice it either. So I wouldn't say this is, like, the best, the best deck of the format or anything, but it's probably one of the best builds of this deck that you can make. So if you're interested in this archetype, definitely check this build out. The next Rakdos aggro deck is more of a mid-range style, has the underdogs in there, Harvesters, Hero Trespasser, Shieldred, like we're used to seeing in these Rakdos decks. And I'm just going to skip over the fact that all these decks have these cards from now on, because we have 2 more tournaments to go to and not that much time. But let's talk about what is different with these decks. There is Cut Down and there is Invoke Despair. The card that stands out to me from this last Rakdos deck is Evolved Sleeper. And this is a card that I played with in the mono black deck that I was really impressed with. This 1-drop can draw you so many cards. You have to deal with this, and it requires removal, and it can get out of range of Cut Down. So you have to draw Cut Down pretty quick if you're playing against this card. And this card is if you're listening here on the podcast and not watching it on YouTube, it's a 1 mana, 1/1. You can pay a black to have it become a human cleric. That's a 2/2. You can pay 1 and a black. If it's already a cleric, it becomes a 3/3 with Death Touch, I believe so. And then you can pay 1 and double black if it's Phyrexian. put a +1/+1 counter on it, then you draw a card and lose a life. So you can keep paying the 3 over and over again to keep buffing this and drawing more cards and more cards and more. So very strong 1-drop, and I would assume that this card put in a lot of work. What do you think about this card?
Yeah, I think this card's really cool. One thing that stands out about this format is that there are just not a lot of very good 1-drops, and this one I think is. The other thing is that it's very nice in these kinds of formats to have a 1-drop that you're excited to play on turn 1, and that you're not super upset to be top decking in the late game. So you play Evolved Sleeper on 1, you can beat down your opponent with it. You're both hellbent, you draw Evolved Sleeper, alright, pump a bunch of mana into it all at once, get drawing your cards, and have like a 5/5 beater that's just beating the crap out of your opponent. I think this card's pretty exciting. I was surprised not to see more of it, honestly, when I was looking at these lists.
When you're both hellbent and you have like 8 or 9 mana, this card wins you the game on the spot. Your opponent can't come back from this unless they draw a removal spell like on their next turn, which is a really strong spot to be in from your 1-drop creature. So really impressed with that. Overall, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 out of the top 8 that are Black X decks that are playing almost the same cards. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the other 2 tournaments. We're going to gloss over those. There's a couple decks I want to go over with you, but most of them, we're going to see a lot of the same. Number 1, first place, Mardu Midrange. This is another Black X midrange deck. The cards that this deck is playing that the other ones aren't is 1 Archangel of Wrath, which is the Siege Rhino on an Angel. That is a 3/4 life linker, which is really strong. We have Henrika Dumnathi, which is, you might be already familiar with if you've seen the last standard, the flip card that turns into a 3/4 lifelink flyer. Liaza Forgotten Archangel, which is a very, very powerful card. The 5 mana 4/5 that flying lifelink that when something dies that your opponent's control gets exiled, and then when your things die, they get exiled and come back to your hand. So it's a lot of value there. And 2 more copies of Sarah Paragon that we've already talked about. 3 Spirited Companions, 1 Tenacious Underdog, and a slew of other removal spells. There's a lot of Planeswalkers and a lot of enchantments in this deck. 2 Wandering Emperors, 1 Elspeth Resplendent. It's got 4 Wedding Announcements, 3 Meat Hooks, a Reckoner Bankbuster, and 4 Fable the Mirror. What do you think about this Mardu list? It's something that I would definitely play, but what do you think about it?
One's cool. Like, we've seen a lot of these mid-range decks that are just that the payoff is like Shieldred or, like some 4 or 5 mana black or red creature. But this one, I kind of like that it's just swinging for the fences with these giant angels that, come to think of it, a lot of the creatures in the format right now can't block flyers and certainly can't block big ones. This deck can just push through a bunch of sneaky damage. Judge call. Does Liesa override the blitz trigger from Tenacious Underdog? Like, if Tenacious Underdog dies, does it go back to your hand? Do you still draw the card?
It says whenever another non-token creature you control dies, return it to understand at the beginning of the next end step. So it will die, you will draw the card, and then it will come back to your hand.
What? I see. Okay, I misread it. Okay, yeah, sure.
So,
yeah.
This deck definitely will put your opponent in fits if they aren't running like 4 Infernal Grasp in their deck. Everything has a ton of toughness. Liaza has 5 toughness, Sarah Paragon 4 toughness, Henrika 4 toughness on the flip side, Archangel of Wrath 4 toughness, and a lot of flyers. So that's something that you typically see out of like a lot of mid-range decks, is just a lot of creatures that are just a lot of value.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And that came in first place, so you best believe I'll be playing it. Number 2 is the only Gruul deck that made it top 8, I believe. This is playing 4 Ascendant Pack Leader, 2 Helana and Elena, 4 Kessig Naturalist, 2 Outline Liberator, 4 Reckless Stormseeker, 1 Squee Dubious Monarch, 2 Thundering Raiju, 4 Tovolar Dire Overlord, 1 Voltal Arsonist, and 4 Yavimaya Iconoclast. And this goes along with what I was saying before. There's no Quirion Beastcaller in this deck, and it is a Gruul aggro deck that got second place. It's playing Yavimaya Iconoclast instead as a 2 mana 3/2, and then you can kick it to make like a haste Bonecrusher Giant. It just becomes a 4/3 trample haste. And it has like a
Cool.
Strangle, a Temio Safekeeping, a couple Arlen Pax Hope, a couple Jaya Fiery Negotiator that we've already talked about, and then 4 Kumano Faces Kakazan. So, I mean, what do you think about this Gruul deck?
Yeah, this feels a lot like the old Gruul Werewolves lists from like early AFR standard that didn't quite make the cut. Ascendant Pack Leader is an excellent one drop. It terrorized standard for a while before the Epiphany ban. Reckless Stormseeker, outstanding. Thundering Raiju does get quite a bit of payoff, I think, from Helena and Elena putting counters on things. Reckless Stormseeker, I think, counts as modifying a creature as well, giving it the +1/+0. Tovolar Dire Overlord is really good card advantage. If you hit your opponent with a werewolf with that in play, it feels like you're way behind already. I think this deck's pretty cool.
The modify, it counts as equipment, auras you control, and counters. So it doesn't actually affect +1/+0 ability like that. But one problem I have with this is that Cut Down kills almost everything in this deck. Reckless Stormseeker, it kills. Lana and Elena, it kills. So right away, you cast your 3-drop, it gets 1-for-1 by a 1-drop. So you're losing massive tempo. Tovolar Dire Overlord does dodge this, but everything else dies to it. Even if you kick Yavimaya Iconoclast, the way that's worded, is when it enters the battlefield, it gets the +1/+1 and haste. So it on the trigger of Yavimaya Iconoclast, even when you pump 4 mana into this, or 3 mana into this, I should say, it gets killed by Cut Down. If you can resolve Helena and Elena and it not get cut down, and you start putting counters on things, then you can start winning the game and get through Meathook Massacres and things like that. But I think the presence of every single black deck in the format playing 4 copies of Cut Down, if at least 3, it might just push this deck out, which is probably why you only see one of these decks in the top 8 in 3 tournaments combined.
Yeah, I mean, what you described there applies to just about every aggro deck you could possibly build, right? Like, no aggro deck wants to play 0 creatures that get hit by Cut Down, and this one I think has a pretty decent proportion of cards that don't get hit by Cut Down too. I don't think I'd want to go any. I don't know how many cards that get hit by Cut Down that I would want to cut. In other words,
Is that pun intended?
No, but
I mean,
but I'll take it.
All right. We're going to move on to the next one. It's a mono-white control list, and this is very interesting. It's playing Anointed Peacekeeper, Ao the Dawn Sky, Sanctuary Warden, and Sarah Paragon. And it's just playing a whole bunch of other removal spells and devalue enchantments and planeswalkers. We have Banishing Slash. It's a 2-mana double white sorcery. Destroy up to 1 target artifact, enchantment, or tapped creature. Then, if you control an artifact and an enchantment, make a 2/2 white samurai with vigilance. It's playing 3 of these. That is absolutely, mind-boggling to me. I've never heard of this card before now, and there's 3 of it in the top 8 deck, which is pretty cool. There's 2 Destroy Evil, which is, I think, the new Valorous Stance-like card in the format. You can destroy a creature with toughness 4 or greater, which is basically Shieldred, and then destroy an enchantment, and enchantments are everywhere. Wedding Announcement, Fable the Mirror Breaker, they're all here in this format, and this card, I think, has pretty well positioned. 1 Fateful Absence, 3 March of Otherworldly Light, and 1 Vanquish the Horde, which you hardly ever see play. But this card is a 8-mana sweeper that costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield. We have 17 other spells, which are 4 copies of Reckoner Bankbuster, 4 copies of Restoration of Agandro, 4 copies of Wedding Announcement, 4 copies of Wandering Emperor, and 1 Unlicensed Hearse in the main deck. This is an amalgamation of a white deck. I mean, what do you think of this deck?
This deck is cool. It's... I don't know what you get really here from playing mono white instead of playing blue white. Is my biggest complaint about it. But what it's clear what the deck is trying to do. It's trying to play big bodies that want to die, and then it kills everything on the board. and I don't think it's really much harder than that, right? Like, you put AO into play, you cast Vanquish the Horde, or Destroy Evil, or Banishing Slash. You can even target your own creatures with those things. Then they die, and you put a bunch of powerful or value enchantments into play off of that. You get your wedding announcements. You've got your Reckoner Bankbusters. I mean, it does. The deck does one thing, and apparently does it well if it plays third in the tournament.
I think it doesn't play blue because it never doesn't tap out. Like, it always taps out.
Yeah, which seems bad to me. I think that you probably don't want to always be tapping out in your control deck. This deck probably struggles against Planeswalkers. There's like one copy of Fateful Absence, and otherwise you need to attack the Planeswalkers down, which isn't always the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, I would think that this card would get annihilated by Liliana of the Veil. But also, I mean, when you think about it, there's 4 wedding announcements in here, so if you get one of those down, you're in good shape against a Liliana. Or maybe a Wandering Emperor that can keep making tokens. But, I mean, other than that, I mean, it's definitely interesting. And maybe something I'll try once, but I'm just the type of person that just, like, wants to splash a color. I don't know, maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I think you can afford to, and I think you ought to. Like, I think blue is about to be very good in this meta.
All right, let's move on to the next decks, and yeah, Rakdos mid-range, Grixis mid-range, Jund mid-range, Mardu mid-range, and Rakdos mid-range are the next decks in this tournament, and we've already talked a lot about those anyway, and they're pretty much all the same deck. So we're going to move on to the last tournament, and this is the Standard Challenge for Magic Online, right? We have first placed Esper Rafine as another Esper deck, like we've been saying. Second place, Invoke Justice Reanimator. And then we're going to have a slew of mono blacks. Third place, mono black control. Fourth place, mono black control. Fifth place, mono white control. Sixth place, mono black control. And then seventh and eighth is a Rakdos mid-range and a Jund mid-range. So as you can see, there's a theme here. Black mana might be good. Let's talk about this Esper Rafine deck and see if it's different than the last Esper deck we talked about, which is the Flash deck. This one is not a Flash deck. It has 4 copies of AO the Dawn Sky. See, once Vanishing Verse leaves the format, people are just going with the AOs in droves. We have 2 Evolved Sleepers, 4 Rafines, 2 Resolute Reinforcements, 2 Sarah Paragon, 1 Shieldred, and 1 Tenacious Underdog. Got some removal spells and Cut Down, Disdainful Stroke, Infernal Grasp, Make Disappear. So, Disdainful Stroke, 1 Disdainful Stroke, 2 Make Disappear as the counter spells in this deck. And then 11 other cards, Kaido, Liliana of the Veil, Reckoner Bankbuster, Meathook Massacre, Wandering Emperor, and Wedding Announcement. Honestly, with these decks that we've been going over, it just seems like a permanent fest. Like, everything's a permanent. Everything's an enchantment or a planeswalker or a creature, and you don't have much of anything else. The amount of instants and sorceries are, like, at an all-time low, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, because so many of these permanents do such a great job of replacing themselves and affecting the board. Whereas instant sorceries mostly just replace themselves and don't affect the board all that much. Like AO demands an answer. If they do answer it, you get your value right away. If they don't answer it, it just beats them. It beats down your opponent. The same is true for Rafine. The same is true for Tenacious Underdog. The same is true for a lot of these cards. It's one of the things that makes Control so difficult to play right now because the value is just everywhere, and if one thing touches the board that you weren't prepared for, you're already behind.
I think that's why we're going to see more and more copies of Farewell. Imagine you're this Esper opponent, and you see a Reckoner Bankbuster, and a Meathook Massacre, and a Wandering Emperor, and a Wedding Announcement, and a Sarah Paragon that brought something back. Maybe they brought like a Evolved Sleeper back from the graveyard. Maybe they have an AO on board. Maybe there's a Rafine there, right? And all of these things are generating massive value while they're on the board. And then you Farewell them, and then they're left with like a Wandering Emperor. And it exiles everything. Yep. So I think as the formats go along and as these mid-range decks start becoming even more powerful, everything is a 2-for-1, as we talked about in the beginning of the episode. You're going to need something to just reset everything, and I think Farewell is just a perfect answer.
Yep, I think Liliana does a pretty good job against Farewell. It's a 6-mana card. By turn 6, a lot of the time Liliana is going to have your opponent hellbent, so that can be one way to answer it. You've got a bunch of copies of Duress, of course, and 2 copies of Make Disappear and a Stroke. So you have defenses against that, but I definitely see what you're saying.
Moving on to the second deck list that got second place here is the Invoke Justice Vanimator deck. This is a green-white deck, I believe. Or it's a red-green-white deck. The only green spell being Titan of Industry. And every single card in this deck is a 4 of.
Yeah.
This person has a game plan, and they're sticking freaking to it.
That is clean.
Yeah, it's so clean. There's only one of in this entire 75, and it's one Jaya Fiery Negotiator in the sideboard, and then like a one of like lands, Iganjo and Sokenzan, and then that's it. The one drops. For the one ofs. 4 Sanctuary Warden, 4 Spirited Companion, 4 Titan of Industry, 4 Cathartic Pyre, 4 Invoke Justice, 4 Fable the Mirror Breaker, 4 Elder Dragon War, which is the one that deals 2 damage to everything, and it can find your combo pieces, discard your Titan of Industry, and also make a 4/4 dragon, so really good for this deck. 4 Restoration of Iganjo, 4 Wandering Emperor, and that's it.
Yeah. And just think about what that says about the cards Wandering Emperor and Fable of the Mirror Breaker that this deck placed second overall in the Standard Challenge. Because without those 2 cards, this deck effectively spins its wheels and does nothing until turn 5 at the earliest. That's not something you can usually afford to do, but 4 copies of Fable and 4 copies of Wandering Emperor are just so good at producing value and stabilizing the board that you can get away with it with something like this.
Yeah, there's no sweepers. There's no like 1 mana interaction. There's just 4 Cathartic Pyres that can maybe kill your opponent's thing, maybe. Like, I mean, you look at this deck at first glance, and you're like, how did this deck win? And then you realize that Sanctuary Warden and Titan of Industry are that good of cards as well. When they enter the battlefield, they have a really good effect, and also they're just huge. One's like a 5/5, and it 5/5 and it has a indestructible counter on it, whatever you call those, the shield counter. It makes a 1/1. It draws a card. Titan of Industry does way too many things. Like, once you get the stuff out, you basically just can't lose the game. So I guess this deck says, hold on for a second until I get my Titan of Industry. You just wait, and then they win the game.
And God forbid the opponent plays Unlicensed Earths.
Oh yeah. I mean, well, then you can win with Wandering Emperor and Elder Dragon War and maybe Fable of the Mirror Breaker if you're lucky. It'd be a hard cast of Sanctuary Warden.
That's what I'm saying, right? Like, if you can't make the Invoke Justice plan work, or it takes too long to make it happen, Wandering Emperor and Fable of the Mirror Breaker were still good enough to get this to second place in the Standard Challenge.
Which is saying a lot.
Yeah.
We do have 2 copies of Squee Dubious Monarch in the sideboard. One of the other reasons why I wanted to bring up Squee is that it's just really good against the things that are good against this deck, which is Liliana of the Veil and Invoke Despair.
So funny to me to see Invoke Justice, which has 4 white pips, and 4 Titan of Industry, which has 3 green pips in the same deck. Like, it's nothing. But
yeah, I mean, you know what solves everything? Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It makes every deck better. All right, now moving on to Mono Black Control. This is like the only time I'm going to cover Mono Black because there's 3 more of these. We have Concealing Curtains, Evolved Sleeper, Graveyard Trespasser, Shieldred, and Tenacious Underdog as the creatures. Instants and sorceries, Cut Down, Infernal Grasp, 4 Invoke Despair, and a Soul Transfer. And the other spells are 3 Reckoner Bankbuster, 2 Sorin the Mirthless, and 3 Meathook Massacre. This is as Mono Black gets. And then Oops, everything in this deck is a good card. Like, every card. I mean, I guess besides Concealing Curtains, but I mean, it could come up. It's a 3/4 for 1.
Yeah. The main problem you tend to run into with these kinds of mono black decks is the lack of card advantage. It's pretty tough to draw cards in these colors, or in this color, I guess. Invoke Despair will draw you cards by the time you get to cast it, but you have to find it, and that's not always easy to do with only 4 copies in the deck. Reckoner Bankbuster is like probably the glue that low key holds this deck together. Look at the mana base. There's 4 copies of Field of Ruin, 1 Takenuma, and everything else is a basic swamp. There are 21 cards that are just swamps and do nothing else. Yeah, we really miss those man lands a lot.
Yeah, the creature lands are really, really good. Um, I think this is sneaky card advantage. There's more card advantage than meets the eye. Don't forget, there's 4 Evolve Sleepers in this deck. Graveyard Trespasser, your opponent has to discard a card to deal with this. Interestingly, there's no Liliana the Veil in this mono black deck.
Yeah.
We also have Tenacious Underdog that keeps coming back out of the graveyard. There's a lot of card advantage there. And then Invoke Despair almost always draws 2 cards. If your opponent just has a creature, it kills their opponent's planeswalkers and enchantments, which usually mono black can never deal with. I guess I can deal with planeswalkers more than enchantments can. More than enchantments, but Invoke Despair is really, really strong. And also this has Deceptive Reach, too. Not only does Graveyard Trespasser drain your opponent, but so does Shieldred. Drain your opponent as well. Soar on the Mirthless creates 2/3 flyers, and Invoke Despair deals 6 damage. Sometimes you just win the game because you cast Invoke Despair. Your opponent's like, oh wait, I need to fill up the board so I don't die to another Invoke Despair. Then they cast it again. And then you're like, wait a second, I need to fill up the board again so my opponent doesn't kill me with Invoke Despair. And then you can't, and then you die to Invoke Despair. I promise you it happens. Every time, Invoke Despair draws into Invoke Despair. Maybe this is just like an anecdotal thing, but it just happens. I promise you it happens. How did all 3 of these mono black control decks with top 8 the standard tournament on Magic Online? It's because Invoke Despair draws into more copies of Invoke Despair, and then you die.
Yeah, I play this deck and I draw 10 swamps and die.
Oh, no. It's definitely not that. You have not... Invoke Despair just... You need to just pray to the mono black gods, and then Invoke Despair will treat you. And Invoke Despair did treat these 3 players better because there's 3 copies of mono black in the top 8. Alright, moving on to the next deck that we're going to talk about is Mono White Control. We already talked about Mono White Control, but this one's a little bit different. It says Control, but there's honestly a bunch of creatures. There's 4 Guardian of Nubenalia, discards a card, gain indestructible. Rafine's Informant, which draws a card and discards a card. Sanctuary Warden, Sigardian Savior, 4 copies of it, 4 Spirited Companion, and this is another Invoke Justice deck. What they're doing is, they have general aggressive threats anyway, like Guardian of Nubenalia and Rafine's Informant, but they're also incidental discard. To discard Sanctuary Warden and Sigardian Savior, to have your Sigardian Savior revived from Invoke Justice, and then Sigardian Savior revives the Sanctuary Warden. Wait, no, it doesn't. It revives the Spirited Companion, or the Guardian of Benalia, or the Rafine's Informant. So it plays a 12 2-mana creatures to bring back with Sigardian Savior, and just 4 Sanctuary Wardens, and just hope that the Graveyard Invoke Justice plan, or the in general aggro plan, wins the game, which is similar to the other Invoke Justice deck that we just saw before that got second place. The other spells in this deck are 2 Reckoner Bankbuster, 1 Celestis, 4 Restoration of Agandro, 4 Wandering Emperor, and 1 Wedding Announcement. What do you think of this deck? It's a little bit similar to the other one, but just like mono white. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, this one's pretty cool. I like having the early aggressive threats to just incidentally fill your graveyard so that you're not all in on the combo. The only other thing I want to call out, so since we've mostly, I think, talked about Invoke Justice so far, is the synergy between Celestis, Restoration of Aganjo, and Invoke Justice. Restoration of Aganjo and Celestis, there are 5 of those cards in the deck, and they all ramp you into Invoke Justice a turn early. Restoration of Aganjo in particular fills the graveyard, and so does the Celestis if you flip from day to night or vice versa. I think the core of those 3 cards is pretty strong. It just kind of sucks that the best thing you can realistically get back is a Sanctuary Warden. Which I don't think is quite powerful enough, but I could be wrong.
I think it's a card that dodges a lot of the removal, just like Shieldred does. Having 5 toughness is really good. Dodging Infernal Grasp with having the shield counter is really good. It makes a 1/1 and draws a card as soon as it enters the battlefield and when it attacks, which is also really good. Making the 1/1 is more important than you'd think, because it dodges Invoke Despair and Liliana of the Veils Minus. So there's a lot of things that this deck does that don't really meet the eye, but I mean, I think it's very interesting, that's for sure. It's funny because it's not the only mono white deck that we've seen in these top 8s. So if you want to play a mono white mid-range / control deck, this is probably the format for you as of right now until the meta changes to more blue-based decks, which I think it will, and that might be something we talk about on the next week's. For now, these tap out, play huge spells decks have been working out. Let's see. The other Decks in this top 8 of this tournament here in Magic Online is Rakdos Control, which is Rakdos mid-range, basically. Plays all the cards that we've already talked about. The only difference being 3 Evolve Sleeper in this deck, and also 2 main deck copies of Abrade, and 2 main deck copies of Flame Blessed Bolt, which I think will be played a lot more going into the next week, because it exiles Underdog. Now, this 8th place Jund list, the only thing this deck plays that is different is the only deck playing 4 copies of Soul of Windgrace. That's how good the card is. And also, the only deck playing main deck Riveteer's Charm and main deck Unleash the Inferno. We've seen those cards in the sideboard, but this one's main decking them. And this one also is main decking 3 copies of Diregraph Rebirth, which is a reanimate spell that becomes cheaper with how many creatures die this turn. So it actually pairs really well with cards like Meathook Massacre. But what's interesting about this deck is there's actually no Meathook Massacres in this deck at all. The only enchantment is Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Doesn't even have them in the sideboard. There is 2 Toxrills as like the only kind of pseudo sweeper in this entire deck. I'm not sure how that worked out for them. Maybe they just didn't play against a lot of things that Meathook Massacre would be good against, which I can't really imagine. But what do you think about this deck as we close?
Yeah, this deck is kind of all in on the reanimator aspect. Right? Like the non-reanimation threats are not super great. You're not playing for you're not really hoping to be hard casting Titan of Industry in this deck, right? You really want to be reanimating it. I do think that the main deck Unleash the Inferno can catch a lot of people off guard. It's a relatively clean answer to Fable of the Mirror Breaker. We've seen a ton of wedding announcement decks that Unleash the Inferno is also quite good against. Soul of Windgrace is also just a hell of a card. And Fable of the Mirror Breaker, you're playing 4 copies of that. You can make a top 8.
That's true. Well, those are the 3 tournaments we wanted to go over with you. Let's go ahead and go to the end step. And I just want to say, for all of you folks that have listened to this podcast, thank you so much for the time that you've taken to listen to us. I know it's only the second episode that we've done so far, but if you got any value from this whatsoever, please let us know. You can find Airball at Airball MTG on Twitter, that is, right?
Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube, yep.
Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube, Airball MTG. Please let us know if you got any value out of this whatsoever. You can find me at The One Jame on Twitter, The One Jame on Twitch, and The One Jame on YouTube as well. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of this. Also to the YouTube channel, and we also have a channel that we just created on Twitter as well. It is at Nuts and Bolts Pod on Twitter. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time, and I'll see you in the top 8.
See everyone.